All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're cracking open a fascinating case file, T.S. Eliot's game-changing 1921 essay. We're going to take a close look at a group of poets who are, let's be honest, more famous than they are understood, the Metaphysicals. So, let's get this investigation started. And right away, we run smack into our central mystery. What in the world does metaphysical poetry actually mean? It just sounds so heavy, right? Academic, a little intimidating maybe? But you'll see, as T.S. Eliot himself found out, the answer is anything but simple. And here's the thing, Eliot tells us right away what the problem is. From the get-go, the term metaphysical was never just a neutral description. As he puts it here, it was either used as an insult, calling poets needlessly complicated, or it was this dismissive pat on the head, like, oh, what a quaint little hobby. And that's exactly why Eliot knew a real investigation was needed. So this is where our investigation really kicks off. It's a problem of definition. I mean, how are you supposed to define something when its very name is just loaded with all this historical baggage? Eliot doesn't waste any time. He gets straight to the heart of it. This says it all, doesn't it? Even for a giant of literary criticism like T.S. Eliot, this was a tough nut to crack. Trying to define this poetry, it's kind of like trying to figure out how a really complex old machine works. All the parts seem connected, but the overall design, it's not obvious. Which leads to a pretty big question. If it's this hard to figure out what connects them, should we even be calling them a group at all? And that brings us to our next line of inquiry. Were these poets really a school or a movement like we think of them today? Or are we just trying to force a bunch of people into a box that they don't actually fit in? Let's round up the usual suspects. I mean, just take a quick look at this lineup. They are all over the map. You've got John Donne, whose style is rooted in that dramatic, late Elizabethan world. Then there are courtly poets like Townshend. And then you have this whole other crew, Herbert, Vaughan, Crawshaw, who are writing this incredibly personal, intense religious poetry. This was definitely not some formal club with membership cards. They were just poets writing at the same time, with very, very different goals. Okay, so if they're not a coherent school, what's the connection? Is there any piece of shared evidence that links them? Well, Eliot zeroes in on one key technique, the thing that's often seen as their signature move, the very special, very weird kind of metaphor called the conceit. But, it's not that simple. Eliot sees that even this key piece of evidence isn't one size fits all. He breaks it down into two totally different methods. On the one hand, you've got elaboration. That's where a poet grabs one comparison and just stretches it as far as it can possibly go. And on the other hand, you have the complete opposite, telescoping images, which is like a sudden, shocking car crash of different ideas. Let's see this elaboration thing in action. This is from John Donne, and it's super famous. He compares two lovers' souls to the two legs of a drawing compass. It's a weird comparison, right? Almost scientific. But he doesn't just say it and move on. No, he develops it, explains how one soul is the fixed foot in the center, while the other one circles around it, but they're always connected. He milks that one single comparison for everything it's worth. Okay, now get ready for some whiplash. Check out the sheer speed and power of this line, also from Donne. A bracelet of bright hair about the bone. Bam! In just 8 words, he smashes together two completely opposite images. The living, vibrant, beautiful, bright hair with the stark, final image of a bone. It's a sudden jolt, a real shock to the system. That's telescoping. Now, as you can probably guess, not everyone was a fan of this kind of shocking intellectual style. In fact, probably the most famous takedown came from the literary heavyweight of the 18th century, Dr. Samuel Johnson. Let's hear the case for the prosecution. And there it is. This is the classic criticism of the metaphysical style. Dr. Johnson argued that these poets weren't being clever, they were being violent. He said they were taking heterogeneous ideas, stuff that is wildly different, that has no business being together, and yoking them together by force. It's like chaining a cat and a dog to the same cart and expecting them to pull in the same direction. So what's Johnson really saying here? His main charge is that the whole thing feels forced. It feels unnatural. In his view, the poet isn't really showing us some deep, hidden connection between things. They're just showing off, proving how smart they are by linking two totally random things. The ideas are stuck together, sure, but they never really become one. So, is that it? Case closed? Are these poets just guilty of being pretentious show-offs? Well, not so fast. Because this is where our lead investigator, T.S. Eliot, comes back with a stunning rebuttal, and he turns the prosecution's entire argument completely on its head. Eliot's move here is it's brilliant. He basically looks at Dr. Johnson's argument and says, "You're absolutely right. These poets do yoke dissimilar ideas together, but that's not a flaw. That's what poetry is." He argues that this very act, this forcing of all kinds of different material into a new unified whole, well, that's the fundamental job of any great poet's mind. And then, for the killer evidence, the smoking gun, if you will, Eliot does something amazing. He quotes Dr. Johnson's own poetry. Just look at this. Johnson yokes the huge abstract concept of fate with these very concrete physical images, a barren strand, a petty fortress. He is doing the exact same thing he criticized the metaphysicals for, fusing different kinds of ideas into one. So we have our verdict. According to Eliot's investigation, the metaphysical style isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's not a flaw, it is a powerful, direct look at the poetic mind in action, fusing experiences, yoking ideas, and forcing them all into a new, surprising, and unified whole. And that leaves us with a really cool thought to chew on. This whole idea of yoking, unlike things together, isn't that just the engine of creativity itself? Think about it. A chef combining sweet and spicy flavors, a musician fusing jazz and hip-hop, an engineer combining biology and robotics to make something new. Eliot's investigation of these 17th century poets actually reveals a timeless truth about how we create. So, where do you see it at work in your world? All right, so last time we talked about the rise of the metaphysical poets. Well, today we're getting into the essay that single-handedly rescued their reputation from the dustbin of history. T.S. Eliot's absolutely groundbreaking defense of their wild, unique, and powerful style. Now, to really get what Eliot did, we have to start with the guy who kind of set the stage for their bad rap, the literary giant Samuel Johnson. His famous take was that these poets were just showing off, violently smashing totally unrelated ideas together. And for him, that wasn't clever. It was a huge poetic flaw. But what if that clash of ideas wasn't a flaw at all? What if it was the whole point? Well, T.S. Eliot came along and said Johnson had it completely backwards. He argued that this so-called violence was actually the very source of their genius. Okay, so let's really get into this. To see the brilliance of Eliot's argument, we first have to dig into what Johnson was actually saying, and then we can watch, step by step, as Eliot just completely takes it apart. So here's the first move, and it's a fascinating one. Eliot just flips Johnson's main criticism right on its head. Johnson says, hey, forcing different ideas together is a weakness, and Eliot just fires back, hold on a second, that heterogeneity you're talking about, that's not a flaw. It's something you find in almost all great poetry. It's not the exception, he says. It's the rule. And here is the absolute masterstroke. To prove his point, Eliot uses Johnson's own poetry against him. He quotes from Johnson's famous poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes, and points out that its power comes from the exact same thing he criticized, a sharp contrast of ideas. A name that once made the world tremble is now just used to adorn a tale. That's the stuff. So let's follow Eliot's case as he builds it. He argues that when it's done right, this yoking of ideas doesn't create chaos at all. No, it creates something profound and beautifully unified. And boy, does he have the perfect example to prove it. He points us to this incredibly moving poem by Bishop King, Exeky, which was written for his wife after she died. In it, the poet creates this long, elaborate comparison, this extended metaphor, where his entire life is now just a slow, steady journey to meet her again in death. And the sound of his own pulse? That's the soft drumbeat marking his slow march toward her. It's just heartbreaking. And here's the crucial point Eliot makes. This isn't just some clever comparison he tacked on. No. In this poem, Eliot says, the idea and the simile become one. The journey isn't just like his grief, it is his grief. The thought and the image have completely fused together into one seamless, deeply powerful emotional experience. Okay, but what about that other big criticism, that this poetry is just needlessly complicated and intellectual? Well, Eliot says, if you actually slow down and look at the words they use, you find a completely different story. He uses these lines from an ode by Lord Herbert of Cherbury as an example. Now, the idea here is incredibly profound, right? two lovers becoming a single unified mystery after they die. But just look at the words he uses. Gone. No more. You. I. They're so simple, so direct, so pure. So what Eliot shows us is that while the words are simple, the sentence structure can get complex. But, and this is key, he insists this isn't a bad thing. He calls it a fidelity to thought and feeling. These poets were building sentences that could actually follow the real twists and turns of a complex human thought, which is way more honest than some of the polished, artificial stuff that came later. And this right here, this brings us to the absolute heart of Eliot's entire argument. He believed that these poets had a unique mental and emotional power, a special way of experiencing the world that, he feared, had been lost. He gave it this famous name, a sensuous apprehension of thought. Now, what on earth does that mean? It means that for these poets, a thought wasn't just some abstract idea floating around in their head. They could feel a thought with the same directness, the same intensity, as you or I might smell a rose or taste an apple. It was a total fusion of the mind and the senses. He saw this power shine in poets like George Chapman, who were these incredibly well-read guys. For them, reading about philosophy or science wasn't about collecting trivia. No, that knowledge actually changed their mode of feeling. An idea they read in a book could literally become a new way to feel the world around them. This bit from Chapman is the perfect example of what he's talking about. Chapman isn't just telling us about the idea of man being unified with the universe. Eliot argues that he's recreating that thought as a physical feeling, that sensuous apprehension of what it actually feels like to be one with everything. You don't just understand it intellectually, you experience it in your gut. Okay, so this raises a huge question, right? If this unified way of thinking and feeling was so powerful, so amazing, what happened to it? Where did it go? This is where Eliot proposes his most radical, most famous theory. He claimed that sometime in the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility happened in the English mind. A kind of split occurred. Thought and feeling, which for the metaphysicals had been one and the same, went their separate ways. Poets after them either thought or they felt, but they lost that incredible ability to do both at the exact same time. And this brings us right back around to Samuel Johnson. See, Johnson was a product of that split. So when he looked back at the metaphysical poets, all he could see was the analytic part, the clever thinkers who took the world apart. What he totally missed, what Eliot saw so clearly, was that after they took the world apart, they put it back together into a new, stranger, and more profound unity. So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? First, what Johnson called a flaw was actually a universal poetic strength. Second, simple language can carry the weight of incredibly complex feelings. And most importantly, the greatest poets possess a unified sensibility, that amazing power to feel their thoughts, a power Eliot feared that modern poetry, and maybe the modern world itself, had lost. And that leaves us with this final, lingering question. Eliot diagnosed this great split in our consciousness over a century ago. When you look at the art, the culture, and even just how our own minds work today, you have to ask, was he right? And if that amazing unity of thought and feeling was lost, has it ever really come back? All right, welcome back. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating theory from T.S. Eliot's famous essay on the Metaphysical Poets. He argues that poetry lost something huge, something fundamental, right after the 17th century. And his whole theory tries to explain not just what we lost, but also why modern poetry can feel, well, so difficult sometimes. So here's Eliot's big idea. He thinks something profound, something major, shifted in the English mind, and because of that, in its poetry. He believed poets just lost the ability to smash thought and feeling together into one single, seamless experience. So the question is, how did this superpower get lost? Let's dig in and find out. Okay, so to really help us see this change, Eliot does something pretty brilliant. He contrasts two totally different ways of writing about love, separated by a couple of centuries. So on one side, you've got the early metaphysical poets, guys like John Donne. Eliot calls them intellectual. And on the other side, you have the later Victorian poets, like Tennyson, and he labels them reflective. For Eliot, this difference is absolutely everything. Here's a way to think about it. The intellectual poet gets a new idea and feels it like a punch to the gut. The reflective poet gets a punch to the gut and then sits down to think up an idea about it. See the difference? And Eliot uses this bit from Tennyson as a perfect example of that reflective style. So the poet sees this family, right? A really sweet scene. He reflects on it, and it's that reflection that makes his heart start to beat. You see the sequence there? It's observation, then thought, and then feeling. It's all happening in separate stages.
So the big question is, what on earth happened in those 200 years between a poet like Donne and a poet like Tennyson? What caused this massive shift? Well, Eliot has a name for it. He calls it the dissociation of sensibility.
Now, before this big split, Eliot says poets like Donne had what he called a unified sensibility. So what does that even mean? What does it feel like? Well, imagine you have this really complex philosophical idea, but instead of just thinking about it, you feel it with the same punch as pure joy or deep sadness. For these poets, a thought wasn't just some abstract thing floating around in their head. Nope, it was a physical, immediate experience, just as real, just as direct as smelling a rose. And this quote just nails the core idea, doesn't it? For a metaphysical poet, a new thought hitting their brain was just as powerful, just as impactful as a major life event. It wasn't just learning a new piece of information. It was a full-on transformation. It literally changed who they were right then and there. But then it happened. This great split. Thinking and feeling, which used to be welded together, just went their separate ways. That's the dissociation. And Eliot makes this incredibly dramatic claim. He says the English mind and its poetry has been suffering from this split ever since. And we've never recovered. You know, Eliot described this unified mind as having this kind of creative, digestive system. It's a great metaphor. It could just devour totally unrelated experiences. I mean, everything from reading heavy philosophy, to falling in love, to hearing a typewriter, to smelling dinner cooking, and it could just digest it all, metabolize it into one single, new, poetic thing. Pretty amazing, right? Okay, but if this unified sensibility was so powerful, so amazing, why did it disappear? Well, Eliot argues it didn't just quietly fade away, oh no. He points the finger directly at two literary giants, some of the most influential poets ever. He says this split, this dissociation, was aggravated, made worse, by the huge influence of John Milton and John Dryden. He suggests their specific kind of genius was so powerful, it cast this giant shadow that basically forced poetry down a totally different, more divided path. So here's the trade-off that Eliot saw. You had Milton and Dryden, and they polished the language of poetry until it was this perfect, flawless diamond. You know, it was grand, it was refined, it was brilliant. But in making it so perfect, that raw, explosive, kind of messy but complex feeling of the metaphysicals got lost. It started to seem, as he puts it, crude in comparison. Now, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson for Eliot. Not at all. He uses this entire theory to explain the huge problem facing poets in his own time, back in the early 20th century. So he looks around at the modern world, and what does he see? Just incredible variety, complexity, fragmentation. He says the experience of modern life is just chaotic. It's full of all these separate, disconnected things, which, when you think about it, sounds a lot like that mix of philosophy and cooking smells he was talking about earlier, right? And because life is so complex, Eliot argues the modern poet just can't get away with writing simple reflective poems anymore. It won't work. To capture the truth of modern life, they have to do something different. They have to become more comprehensive, basically absorb everything. They have to be more elusive, more indirect, because meaning isn't simple anymore. They even have to, and I love this phrase, force and dislocate language to get their meaning across. And this method, Eliot points out, looks curiously similar to what the metaphysical poets were doing all along. So what's the big takeaway here? What does this all boil down to? For Eliot, it's a pretty radical call to action. He's telling poets they have to look deeper. They have to write from a place that is way more raw and way more complete than what everyone expects. You know that common advice you always hear, look into your heart and write? Well, Eliot just dismisses it. He says that's not nearly deep enough. Real powerful poetry, the kind that Donne was writing, it doesn't just come from your feelings. It comes from the whole organism. The thinking brain, the firing nervous system, even your digestive tract, your gut. It's poetry that comes from your entire being. And that really leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought, doesn't it? What if the source of the greatest, most profound art isn't just our nice, neat emotions or our intellectual ideas kept in their separate little boxes? What if it's actually the messy, complicated, total fusion of a mind and a body experiencing the world all at once?